orange juice. That's basically 100% carbs. That's gonna lead to a lot of glucose, and it's gonna make your diabetes or your insulin resistance worse. In this study, they saw that diabetes remission was observed in over 57% of participants.
That is not what this study said. The due diligence on her side here is pretty poor. I don't even think she read the full abstract. And also, this is not saying anything about glucose spikes directly. This is saying about not eating carbs or glucose at all. Actually, what we're seeing is these carb sources are improving insulin sensitivity and reversing insulin resistance. We have randomized feeding trial, we have meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and we also have a systematic review and meta-analysis. The reason I'm pointing this out specifically is so that we can start to understand what the true mechanism is. I don't think that glucose and insulin are the direct problems. I think that metabolic dysfunction is, and we need to focus on this to correct the problem instead of focusing on just glucose and insulin. Is the glucose goddess right about the causes of insulin resistance? So in today's video, I want to address the claims that she makes, specifically in one of her most recent videos about the cause of insulin resistance. And the specific points that I want to discuss are the idea that eating carbs causes dangerous blood glucose spikes. I want to talk about insulin resistance being caused by glucose directly. The idea that she talks about that your body is becoming insulin resistant because you have too much insulin. And I also want to talk about the idea here that lowering carbs fixes insulin resistance. So what I'm going to do in this video, I'm going to go directly through her video and I'm going to play different sections where she talks about these things or makes certain claims. And then I'm going to give my perspective on those claims. I'm going to come from as balanced and objective perspective as I can. Obviously, we all have our own biases towards things. So to be fair, I obviously am in the pro-carbohydrate camp. So we'll talk about that, but I am going to support my point of views with research, and I'm actually going to use a research study that she directly cites in the video to refute some of the claims that she makes or the implications that she makes. So let's jump in and let's start to talk about the video directly. All right, so there's this first clip is a perspective that I actually agree on, and I think that Jessie does a really good job of making a case for here about diabetes being related to some dietary components or being a function of things that we eat on a regular basis. And so I'm going to play this clip and I'm going to share some interesting historical data that I think you will like. So let's jump in.
And how do we know that type 2 diabetes is not genetic? We have a few different proofs. First of all, type 2 diabetes used to be called adult onset diabetes. It was called that way because only adults would get it. Well, today, 5-year-old children are getting this condition when that was not the case at all. And our genes have not changed so much. What has changed is what we're eating and the food environment.
So what Jessie is saying here is that the rise in diabetes is not necessarily a genetic phenomenon. What she's talking about is that the rise in diabetes is likely a function of the change in diet, and she's talking about twin studies here, where she gets into twin studies to make this particular point. But something I want to bring up here, so I agree with her. I agree with her perspective. I don't think the rapid escalation in diabetes over the past century is necessarily a function of genetics. I think it's likely a function of diet leading to metabolic dysfunction. Now, Jessie, throughout the video, seems to point to glucose being the actual problem. But if we look at this graphic that I have here, what we can actually see is that from 1909 until 1999, what actually changes in the diet is not necessarily sugar intake. Sugar intake is relatively flat. And the other thing is carbohydrate intake in the form of grains decreased from roughly 37% of calories down to below 25% of calories. And what we actually start to see is that soybean oil and shortening skyrocket as percentages of the diet, as percentage of caloric intake from 1909 until 1999. So soybean oil is almost at 0% of the diet in 1909, and then it jumps up to be, in 1999, almost 8% of the diet. So we have a drastic increase in the consumption of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which inside the bioenergetic point of view, inside the work that Dr. Ray Peat discusses, is one of the main culprits in leading to metabolic dysfunction due to the effects of these fatty acids at the mitochondria. And as we go through this video, you'll see that I think the major problem or cause of diabetes and blood glucose dysregulation and insulin resistance is actually mitochondrial dysfunction, a problem with energy metabolism, and the insulin resistance and high blood glucose levels are more of a side effect of problems inside the mitochondria and not necessarily because glucose is just causing diabetes and the cells just become fatigued and responding to insulin. So that's the first point we're going to get to here. Now I'm going to get to this next section, and what Jesse's going to talk about here is the idea that diet can actually change diabetes. So again, I agree with her. I think that diet can have a significant impact on diabetes. I think she's 100% hit the nail on the head right here. But where I take a little bit of discrepancy with is the idea that glucose is the problem. So let's jump to the section here and hear what she has to say.
And finally, and I think for me, the most compelling piece of evidence is that hundreds of studies have shown us that if we change the way that we eat, we can put our type 2 diabetes into remission. Now, this is the key. If you've been diagnosed with diabetes, your only option is not to take medication for the rest of your life. If you're willing and if you're able to change how you're eating, you can put this condition into remission. Now, I know that for a lot of people, it's really hard to fathom changing how we're eating and our food habits, and it seems like something that is way too complicated and out of reach, but don't worry, the stuff I'm going to share with you today is actually simple and you'll be able to do it. It's not a complicated diet, it's not super restrictive, it doesn't ask you to buy $35 smoothies. We're here for practical, easy tips.
Okay, so there's quite a few things that she said in there that's extremely helpful, and I think her general premise on that is correct. And so what she talks about is we want to be able to have a dietary adjustments that people can actually follow on a consistent basis. We want to be able to use diet and lifestyle factors to change diabetes and metabolic dysfunction and not have to rely on drugs. This is all great. And then at the same time, it is a bit confusing in the spheres to figure out, well, how do I eat? Do I do low carb? Do I do high carb? Do I do vegan? Do I do carnivore? Which exact way do we need to go? And I think trying to provide people with actionable steps is essential. And while I think some of her steps are okay, some of them may not be ideal overall, but a lot of the ideas that she discusses are okay. They're not problematic. The major issue that I get into here and what she's going to talk about through the rest of the video is that glucose and insulin she highlights as the problems. And again, I don't think that the glucose and insulin is directly the problem. I think the research is clear, the literature is clear that the problem is more metabolic dysfunction. So I actually want to read a quote here that kind of supports this point because they're talking about different diets in terms of improving diabetes and glucose regulation, which will show that it's not necessarily about carbs or having too much carbs in the diet that's causing the problem. So this is a review article, and what the researchers state is they say, in this review, we examine recently published literature on the effects of high carbohydrate diets on metabolic parameters in type 2 diabetes. High carbohydrate diets are at least as effective as low carbohydrate diets, leading to significant weight loss and a reduction in plasma glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and low-density lipoprotein cholesterol levels. The major concern is that high carbohydrate diets may raise serum triglyceride levels and reduce high-density lipoprotein levels, increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease. However, these untoward effects were not a persistent consequence and may be ameliorated with the consumption of a low glycemic index, low glycemic load, and high fiber intake. Carbohydrate intake should be individualized, and low caloric intake remains a crucial factor to improve insulin sensitivity and reduce body weight. However, a high carbohydrate diet rich in fiber and with a low glycemic index and load may be recommended in patients with type 2 diabetes. The reason I'm setting this up here is because Jesse is going to go through the rest of this video talking about glucose and insulin causing diabetes. But these researchers who have gone through the research and looked at a variety of different papers have basically shown that high carbohydrate diets are at least as effective as low carbohydrate diets. They can lower plasma glucose levels, they can lower hemoglobin A1C, and they can improve the lipid profile if they are set up appropriately. So you don't have to necessarily go low carb or minimize carbs to improve your metabolic function. you can actually have carbohydrates and do this effectively. And I see this time and time again with clients. This is where I take issue with saying that glucose is the cause or insulin is the cause when the problem is metabolic dysfunction. And this is why you see lowering total energy intake is helpful in these circumstances, because it takes the pressure off the mitochondria when there's a backlog. You have this constant flow of fuel going to the mitochondria. You can think about it like a nuclear reactor, and basically the reactor isn't working well and you're trying to shove fuel into it, but it's not going in because there's dysfunction there. So the solution is not just lower carbs. The solution is to actually correct the metabolic dysfunction. And so that's the major piece. I want to set the stage here as we go through the rest of this video with that research quote. Now, in this next section, Jesse is going to discuss the idea that eating carbs causes glucose spikes, and glucose spikes are a problem for the body. So let's jump to this section here.
So when you eat starches or sugars, they're going to increase your glucose levels in your body. And after a meal, if you ate a lot of those foods, and by the way, those foods are called carbs, generally, starches and sugars are called carbs. If during a meal you eat a lot of carbs, then you're going to experience what's called a glucose spike. That means just a quick delivery of glucose to your body. And you could actually see this if you were measuring your blood. You would see like a big spike, like the one on this graph right here. So glucose spikes are a problem. They make us tired, they make us have cravings, they inflame our body.
Okay, but what I want to talk about here is this idea that glucose spikes are the problem. And so there's an ounce of truth in here. If your blood glucose levels spike too high, they get to over 150 milligrams per deciliter, you're 180, 200, these higher levels, there is indeed a problem with that. However, this is not because you are eating carbohydrate per se. A normal, healthy individual who is eating carbohydrate should not see a massive glucose spike. And I have a picture coming out of a study here where they had participants wearing a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, and then they had them eat meals with high carbohydrate intake. And so I'm actually going to use the meal that spiked the carbohydrates the most, or spiked the blood glucose levels the most, or the CGM readings the most, to actually, I would be fair and use like the highest carbohydrate meal and see the biggest spike. So the participants in this study ate 104 grams of carbohydrates in one meal, 104 grams. And this was in the form of chicken with rice. So it was white rice. So it's straight glucose. It's not a low glycemic index. It's not a low glycemic load. These are healthy individuals. And their blood glucose levels after this meal peaked at 108 milligrams per deciliter. Yes, they reached 108. So if your fasting blood glucose levels are between 80 and 90 and you go up to 108, probably not that much of a problem. Probably not that big of an issue. It's not a massive glucose spike. If you're seeing 180, 170, 200, these different values, that's where you start to see problems. But is this a problem with the carbohydrates, or is the individual having metabolic dysfunction and then eating a bunch of carbohydrates on top of that? And then basically you have all this fuel that is not able to reach into the mitochondria effectively, into the cell effectively, because the mitochondria is impaired. That is the problem. In healthy individuals, carbohydrates don't lead to massive glucose spikes. They should not be a problem on a regular basis. It's when you get metabolic dysfunction that you see the larger spikes. And the problem is the metabolic dysfunction. While it's not good to slam 100 grams of carbs from white rice, if you're a type 2 diabetic in one go, in one meal without other components, the problem is really that the type 2 diabetic individual has this metabolic dysfunction. So I wanted to point this out here because it's extremely important to understand that in normal circumstance, a regular glucose spike is not a problem. When you are metabolically impaired, you will see a larger glucose spike, and that is a symptom or a signal that metabolic dysfunction is present. Okay, in this next section here, what Jesse talks about is the idea that our body tells our pancreas to release insulin to clear glucose spikes because our body knows that glucose spikes are bad for it. I don't think the glucose spike is a problem. I think the metabolic dysfunction is a problem, and that is not the reason why the body is telling the pancreas to release insulin. It's not because glucose spikes are just bad in general. There is a threshold where they are bad, and that's important to understand, and then understand why that is occurring. in a type 2 diabetic or impaired glucose tolerance individual versus a normal healthy individual. And so let's play this clip, jump in, and then I'll talk about what insulin is actually doing in the body. And it's not necessarily just to lower glucose spikes.
And most importantly for our conversation today, they lead to your body sending out insulin. Why does your body respond to glucose spikes with insulin? Because your body knows that big glucose spikes are not good for it. And so it calls your pancreas and it's like, hey pancreas, can you please send out some insulin to get that glucose spike down? So insulin arrives and grabs all the excess glucose and stores it away in your liver, in your muscles, and in your fat cells. So you might be wondering, well, how is it possible that if glucose is the energy of my body, how is it possible that I could give my body too much of it?
Okay, so a couple things here. First thing, your body is not releasing insulin because glucose spikes are bad. It's not there's not some subjective understanding of glucose spikes are good or bad with your endocrine system. The glucose that's coming into your system is signaling the release of insulin so that insulin can lower your release of fatty acids from your tissues because you weren't eating for that period of time, and lower the production of glucose by your liver. That production process is called gluconeogenesis. And so basically when sugar comes in or glucose comes in, your body's like, yay, we have fuel. We don't need to keep breaking down our fat stores and producing glucose or breaking down our glycogen at our liver. So we can stop all of those processes, and now we can use this fuel source that we have brought into the system. Now the next piece is most of the tissues in your body are not insulin dependent. The tissues that are insulin dependent is the fat tissue, the muscle tissue, and the liver. And the reason insulin rises and the insulin amount is adjusted based on the carbohydrate content is because when you have a large amount of carbohydrate coming in, the body starts to put the surplus into the muscle, into the fat, and into the liver, whereas the other tissues are using the glucose as they need without insulin present. So it's basically insulin saying, hey, we have enough fuel here that the liver can rebuild its glycogen, that the muscles can rebuild its glycogen, and that we can replenish some of the fat stores that we were breaking down to provide fatty acids during this fasting phase, during this phase where we didn't have adequate fuel. Now, this doesn't mean that you're going to gain body fat just because there's insulin. There's a balance between how much body fat are you building, how much body fat are you burning, etc. And this is adjusted by many different factors, hormonally, dietarily, activity level, etc. So it's not so simple as, insulin comes in, it stops the release of fat from the fatty acids, and then it leads to some accrual of the glucose into the fat cells, and now I'm getting body fat. It's not that simple. There's more going on to the picture. But what I want to do is I want to read a research quote for you here so you can understand what exactly is going on and see what the research is saying, and saying that insulin is not just shuttling things away into the cell, and it's not about glucose spikes are bad. It's about a shift in metabolism of, hey, we have fuel on board now. We don't need to continue to break our body down. So this is actually a good thing. This is an anabolic process. This is a rebuilding of stores and tissues after we've been in this fasting phase where you're breaking things down. So we're constantly switching between anabolism and catabolism, and insulin is one of the major signals to say, hey, chill out on catabolism. Let's get this anabolism on board. So what they say here, the researchers start with, when insulin is administered to people with diabetes who are fasting, blood glucose concentration falls. It is generally assumed that this is because insulin increases glucose uptake into tissues, particularly muscle. Now, this is also what Jesse assumes, but we're going to see it's not necessarily how things work. What they say, in fact, this is not the case, and is another error arising from extrapolating from in vitro rat data. It has been shown quite unequivocally that insulin at concentrations that are within the normal physiologic range lowers blood glucose through inhibiting hepatic glucose production without stimulating peripheral glucose uptake. As hepatic glucose output is switched off by the cholinergic action of insulin, glucose concentration falls and glucose uptake actually decreases. When insulin is given to patients with uncontrolled diabetes, it switches off a number of metabolic processes, lipolysis, so that's the release of fats, proteolysis, that's the breakdown of muscle tissue and proteins in the body, ketogenesis, the production of ketones, and gluconeogenesis, which is the production of glucose at the liver by a similar chelonic action. Since both ketones and free fatty acids compete with glucose as an energy substrate at the point of entry into the Krebs cycle, so basically into energy metabolism in the mitochondria, glucose metabolism increases inevitably as free fatty acids and ketone levels decrease despite the concomitant fall in plasma glucose concentration. Thus, insulin increases glucose metabolism more through reducing the release of free fatty acids and ketones than it does through recruiting more glucose transporters into the muscle cell membrane. Okay, so why is this important? What's happening here and what they're describing, I know there's a little bit of research jargon in there, but what's happening here is the insulin is, when you eat carbohydrates, insulin is released, and it's saying, stop the fatty acid oxidation, stop the release of fats, and stop the production of glucose at the liver via gluconeogenesis. And then when you lower the fatty acids, because fats and carbs compete inside the mitochondria for oxidation, it lowers the fats, and then now carbs can be used. So again, it's metabolic switching when you have insulin and carbs signal the insulin response through this hormonal control. It's not that insulin is just trying to shuttle blood glucose away because glucose is bad. That's not how this works. It's a signal to switch metabolism. Another thing that I want to point out here, and something that the researchers mention, is that insulin lowers blood glucose levels by lowering hepatic glucose production. So high in diabetes, in impaired glucose tolerance, and in obesity, high blood glucose levels are not because you're just eating carbs. High blood glucose levels, especially at baseline, especially at fasting, are because the liver is producing large amounts of glucose on a regular basis through gluconeogenesis. And when you eat carbs, because the liver is not responding, or the pancreas alpha cells that produce glucagon are not responding to the insulin released by the beta cells, the gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose at the liver, is not being shut down. So you have this carbohydrate coming in on top of this high fasting level from glucagon, from gluconeogenesis, from the production of glucose at the liver that is leading to the problems. And so this would stand in the face of dietary carbohydrates causing the problem. This would be indicative of a hormonal dysregulation and metabolic dysfunction, which is central to diabetes and to insulin resistance. And this is something that's really important to understand, because this changes the strategies that you want to put in place when you're starting to adjust the diet and trying to use a dietary therapy or dietary strategy to resolve metabolic dysfunction and minimize these stress hormones over the long term. Okay, now the next clip that Jesse discusses here is about insulin creating insulin resistance. So when you're just exposed to more insulin, the body just becomes resistant to the insulin. And we're going to jump in here. Again, I don't think this is because the body just gets fatigued to responding to insulin. The central problem is energy metabolism. So we'll watch the clip, and then I have an interesting research quote to share with you here.
Because I have to explain this next part. So I grew up not drinking any coffee. And then I moved to London, and I was studying mathematics, and I had my very first coffee. And let me tell you, that very first coffee of my life, it kept me awake for a very long time. I had a super hard time going to bed that night. I was wired. It was crazy. Now, I started getting used to drinking coffee, and then 3 months later, I needed like 3 cups of coffee a day just to stay awake. And I wondered, what's going on? How is it possible that just a few months ago, 1 cup of coffee was keeping me awake for days, basically, and now I need 3 cups just to wake up in the morning and go to class? Well, what happened was that my body got used to the coffee. My body gradually became resistant to the coffee. So I needed to give my body more and more coffee to get the same effect. Well, with insulin, the same thing happens. When there's lots of insulin in your body for a long time, your body slowly becomes resistant to insulin.
Okay, let's stop there because it just keeps going on the same point. So I actually don't think this is the mechanism, and I think the research is pretty clear that it's not just that the more insulin that is being produced is leading to the cells stopping responding to insulin. what's happening is there's metabolic dysfunction going on inside the cell, and then the cell is unable to effectively respond to the insulin because of what's going on with the metabolism. And what we see in people who have diabetes or obesity or impaired glucose tolerance is that they actually have obvious signs of metabolic dysfunction inside, for example, muscle cells. So this is indicative of the problem. And basically, the more, if you're lean, you don't have the metabolic dysfunction. Things are working well. When you become obese, but you're not diabetic yet, you can see the metabolic dysfunction. And when you have overt diabetes, what you start to see is the metabolic dysfunction is pretty severe. So I have a research quote that I want to share with you that is showing this metabolic dysfunction as a gradation from lean to obese to diabetic, and I think that this is the primary focus or the primary underlying cause of diabetes, of insulin resistance, and not just that the cells are like, yeah, we're tired of responding to insulin. It's like, no, we can't respond to insulin. We can't take up more carbohydrate because we have this dysfunction with our metabolism. So what the researchers say here, they say the insulin resistance of skeletal muscle in glucose-tolerant obese individuals is associated with reduced activity of oxidative enzymes and a disproportionate increase in activity of glycolytic enzymes. So inside our cell, we have the mitochondria that has the Krebs cycle, and then we also have glycolysis that feeds into the Krebs cycle. And so what we see in people who have glucose intolerance or who are diabetic, they actually have less of the ability to actually run the Krebs cycle and cell oxidative phosphorylation, cell respiration, and they rely more on glycolysis when they get when they're exposed to carbohydrate, which means that there's this function going on inside the mitochondria with the Krebs cycle, so that the fuel can only be used through glycolysis, or it gets stuck getting used in glycolysis. So what they continue to say is they say activity for glycolytic enzymes was highest in subjects with type 2 diabetes, following the order of type 2 diabetes being having the highest amount of the glycolytic enzymes, then obesity having the next highest, and in lean individuals having the lowest of the three. And then say, whereas velocity for oxidative enzymes, so these are the enzymes in the Krebs cycle and the mitochondria, was lowest in subjects with type 2 diabetes, and so it was highest in the lean subjects. So essentially what you're seeing is the leaner you are, the better your mitochondria are functioning in terms of using the substrate. And when you start to see obesity and when you start to see diabetes, where these are metabolic dysfunction states, the mitochondria aren't working so well, so all the fuel is getting stuck with glycolysis alone. And so this is indicating that the problem is metabolic in nature and not necessarily the cells just randomly getting tired of responding to insulin because there's so much insulin. So they finish up here and they say the ratio between glycolytic and oxidative enzyme activities within skeletal muscle correlated negatively with insulin sensitivity. So the more insulin sensitive you are, the more oxidative metabolism you have going on, the better your mitochondria are working. Whereas the more insulin insensitive you are, the more insulin resistant you are, the more glycolytic activity you have, the more you're relying on glycolysis, which means, and the reason why that's occurring presumably is because the mitochondria are having dysfunction and oxidative metabolism is not working effectively. They finish up here and they say, in summary, an imbalance between glycolytic and oxidative enzyme capacities is present in type 2 diabetic subjects and is more severe than in obese or lean glucose-tolerant subjects. The altered ratio between glycolytic and oxidative enzyme activities found in skeletal muscle individuals with type 2 diabetes suggests that a dysregulation between mitochondrial oxidative capacity and capacity for glucose is an important component of the expression of insulin resistance. So what they're showing here is that the damage to mitochondrial function and mitochondrial oxidative metabolism is an important component of insulin resistance. And it's not necessarily, again, I think this is where we're starting to see, well, why is the cell not responding to insulin? Is it just because it gets tired because there's more insulin? Or is more insulin floating around because the cell is not able to respond to the insulin, not able to uptake that insulin, degrade that insulin, and also uptake the glucose because of metabolic dysfunction? I think that's actually the problem. So we need to center on metabolic dysfunction and not just glucose, 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 insulin, 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 etc. Now, in this next clip, what Jesse talks about is that eating carbs increase blood sugar levels, and then this will give the body too much glucose, which will increase insulin, and then that causes insulin resistance. So it's you eat carbs, it increases insulin, and then the cells just stop responding to insulin for some unknown reason. They just like get fatigued by it, or they just get used to insulin, and then now you're insulin resistant. And I actually don't think this is the case, and we'll talk about this directly as well. So let's get to this next clip.
So let's say you keep eating the same way you've been eating. So you're eating carbs, and they're increasing your glucose levels. And you're giving too much glucose to your body, but maybe you don't know it. Well, after a while, because of this insulin resistance, insulin is just not working very well anymore, and it's not able to grab all the excess glucose and store it away. So your glucose levels in your blood, they start to rise because the excess glucose is not being disposed of as easily as before. Your glucose levels in your blood start to rise and start to increase. And that is what is measured at the doctor's office.
Okay, so essentially the idea is that if you eat carbohydrates, you increase insulin, and then your body, with the increased insulin, eventually doesn't respond to insulin, becomes insulin resistant. For some reason, the mechanism has not been explained by her. And then now your blood glucose levels rise because your insulin is not signaling the uptake of glucose into the cells anymore because the cells are resistant. So first problem is there's actually no real mechanistic demonstration or explanation of why this occurs. She doesn't actually get into the specifics of why we're seeing this, the cells become resistant to insulin, which this is supposed to be a relatively simple video and it's meant to like not get into the weeds, I guess. But there's no explanation why. She doesn't go into it at all, and we're just supposed to accept this idea that the cells eventually become resistant to insulin, and we don't know why. And I think that's problematic because, again, like it just gives us more questions, and it doesn't provide us with answers that can lead us to effective solutions. Now, the next thing I want to show is that actually eating carbohydrates improves insulin sensitivity in diabetics. So we're going to see this here. I'm going to share a quote for you here. This was a trial in humans. And what they say, to evaluate the effect of increased dietary carbohydrate in diabetes mellitus, glucose and insulin levels were measured in normal persons and subjects with mild diabetes maintained on a 45% carbohydrate diet and an 85% carbohydrate diet. They say fasting plasma glucose levels fell in all subjects and oral glucose tolerance significantly improved after 10 days of the 85% carbohydrate diet. Then they say fasting insulin levels were also lower on the 85% carbohydrate diet. However, insulin responses to oral glucose did not significantly change. These data suggest that the high carbohydrate diet, the 85% carbohydrate diet, increased the sensitivity of peripheral tissues to insulin. So what they're showing here is that on this 85% carbohydrate diet, when they put even diabetics and normal people on 85% carbs, their cells got better at using the carbohydrate, and they needed less insulin to respond to the carbohydrate, to the blood glucose levels. So this flies in the face of her hypothesis. This doesn't mean that I think everybody should go on an 85% carbohydrate diet. I'm just showing this so that we can see that this hypothesis that she is promoting, that it's glucose and then insulin, and the insulin just gets resistant. The more glucose you eat, the more insulin, so then the more insulin resistant you'll get over time, actually isn't reality, because this is an 85% carbohydrate diet, and then you have you're putting more glucose into the system, and you're requiring less insulin to respond to that glucose. The cells are getting better able to use the carbohydrate and don't need as much insulin to actually uptake that carbohydrate, which, again, this is antithetical to her hypothesis and important to show. So in this next section, what she talks about is that breads, pastas, pizzas, fruit juices, and candies are all involved in insulin resistance or making things worse, and you have to take these things out of your diet. So let's jump to this clip here and see this, and then we'll bring some research to actually show something a little bit different.
So how do we give our body less glucose? Well, listen, the most important place to start is to look at these carbs, because the carbs are what turn to glucose as we digest them. So have a look at how you're eating. Are you eating mostly starches and sugars? Are you eating mostly bread, pasta, pizza, sodas, granolas, fruit juices, candy? If that's the case, you're giving a lot of glucose to your body all the time. There's another free thing in the description of this episode. I have lots of stuff I'm going to give you. It's a big table that recaps what are starches, what are sugars, those increase your glucose levels? And then what are proteins, fats, and fibers? And those do not increase your glucose levels. And those are the ones that you want to eat more of and eat less of the carbs. So for example, if you're used to having in the morning a slice of toast with some jam on it and an orange juice, that's basically 100% carbs. That's going to lead to a lot of glucose, and it's going to make your diabetes or your insulin resistance worse. An alternative is to have something like a hot tea and some soft-boiled eggs with a little bit of sea salt on them.
So first things first, we already saw in the previous study that increasing carbohydrate intake at least up to 85% for the 10 days for the diabetics and also the healthy people there, increase insulin sensitivity. So this, again, the idea that just having glucose or more glucose in the diet is going to cause these problems, I don't think that that's necessarily the case. We've already shown that there's some evidence counter to that. But the next piece is, in terms of, well, breads, pastas, pizzas, and candies are an issue, and I think there's problems with some of those foods besides the fact that they have glucose in them. And I don't want to get into the specifics there, but to just look at these foods have glucose that are problematic is extremely reductionistic and I don't think helpful at all, especially we'll look at some research here. The next thing, in terms of the diet, it would actually be ideal to have adequate amount of protein, adequate amount of carbs, adequate amount of fat, and an adequate amount of micronutrients and components. So I agree with her that just having a breakfast that is just toast and jam is probably not ideal in the long run. Number one, it's hard to get enough calories doing that. Number two, there's no protein there, which is extremely helpful. And number three, there's also not really a lot of fat. And if somebody is having some blood glucose roller coaster symptoms, it could be because they're taking in rapidly digesting carbs and then not with any protein, not with any fat, not with any fiber. It's hitting the system fast. The system's distributing and using the carbohydrate, and then you're getting the blood sugar drop after. A lot of people feel this. So setting up the diet appropriately is important, which why I don't think a lot of her hacks are really that bad. They can be helpful for people. But her idea for her breakfast is like just have some eggs and tea. I don't think that's going to fly. I think we want to have carbohydrate inside the meal. The carbohydrate is important to have. There are benefits to it. It helps to lower stress. And I don't think that, and what we'll see here, we'll talk about different carbohydrate sources. They're not causing insulin resistance, at least per the studies. So I have meta-analysis, systemic reviews, and randomized trials here showing different carbohydrate sources that are actually improving metabolic function. So let's start with oats. A lot of people like to have oats for breakfast. So you could have your 2 eggs and you can have oats. But are oats going to ruin your metabolic function? Let's see. So the systematic review and meta-analysis on oats, what they show here is they say, compare with controls, oat intake significantly reduced the concentration of glycosylated hemoglobin A1C. So hemoglobin A1C levels decreased. Fasting blood glucose, total cholesterol, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol also all decreased with the oats. So we're seeing improvement with a glucose-containing food of hemoglobin A1C, fasting glucose, and the lipid profile. Then what they say is oatmeal significantly reduced the acute postprandial glucose and insulin responses compared with a control meal. The present study has revealed a beneficial effect of oats intake on glucose control and lipid profiles in type 2 diabetic patients. So this was in type 2 diabetic patients. Now, I have clients who have type 2 diabetes and they do fine with oats. Potatoes, they do fine with whole fruits. These things are not a problem. I'll talk about fruit juice in this next clip here and we'll get into the specifics, but I don't think that oats or potatoes or whole fruits or whatnot are a problem with people with diabetes or with normal healthy people in general, especially if the diet is situated appropriately, caloric intake situated appropriately, micronutrient density is on point. You're going to need to get your energy from somewhere, and it's going to be carbs, fats, and protein. So we need to have enough of these things, and there are benefits to having carbs. That's besides this video. I've talked about that in the past in terms of their effects on the mitochondria and also in terms of their effects on the stress hormones. Now let's get the fruit juice. This is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials with fruit juice. And what the authors say is they say fruit juice consumption did not show a significant effect on fasting glucose and insulin concentrations. The net change was 0.79 milligrams per deciliter for fasting glucose concentrations and negative 0.74 micro IU per milliliter for fasting insulin concentrations in fixed effect models. So essentially, the fruit juice actually lowered fasting insulin levels and bumped fasting glucose levels up, not even 1 milligram per deciliter. So if you were at 90 milligrams per deciliter before you had fruit juice, after you had fruit juice, you'd be at 90.79 milligrams per deciliter. So it's not making a big difference here. Now, something to mention, if somebody has diabetes, it's important to not slam high amounts of fruit juice in one time on this individual. Why? Is it because of the glucose and carbs? Kinda. The problem is if you have metabolic dysfunction at the cell, if you have this nuclear reactor and it's not really doing well, it's overheating, is it a good idea to flood the system rapidly with fuel? Probably not. Actually, we know it's not. So if you're dealing with type 2 diabetes, what you want to do is you want to have carbohydrate sources that do not smash the system rapidly, because your ability to take this fuel and turn it into energy is very much impaired. So you're going to want to stick with oats. You're going to want to stick with whole fruits. You're going to want to stick with potatoes and yams and things like this that don't hit the system so fast in terms of providing this fuel. And this is why in the initial quote that I talked about in the beginning of this video, they were saying to use low glycemic index, low glycemic load carbs. Basically, you just want some carb sources that have some fiber present. Now, to be fair, Jesse does talk about having some fiber present with the carbs so that you can slow down some of the absorption. In normal, healthy individuals, I don't think this is that important if you're very insulin sensitive. But if you have insulin resistance, those things can actually help to a large extent. And I see this with clients that I work with who are wearing CGMs, who are on insulin, who are on all types of diabetes medications, who are trying to lose weight and to improve their blood glucose handling. And yes, I use these whole food carb sources, and I don't usually slam large amounts of juice until metabolic function improves significantly, and even then, maybe not large amounts of juice, but the juice is fine at that point. So context overall is very important in terms of which carb sources you're using and how you are using them. Now, the last one here is a randomized trial on the feeding of potatoes and also beans, which are both very rich in carbs. And so what they show here is the potato and bean diets were equivalent in their effect on the blood glucose response, although the reduction from baseline were not statistically significant. However, both diets improved measures of insulin resistance. Both diets resulted in significant reductions in body weight and BMI without affecting appetite. To our knowledge, this is the first randomized trial investigating the effect of potatoes as part of a daily meal pattern for 8 weeks on metabolic outcomes in controlled feeding settings. We demonstrated that, contrary to observation from epidemiologic studies, potatoes do not adversely affect the glycemic response. Indeed, consistent with studies showing that consumption of potatoes with meat or fat reduces the glycemic response, the potato diet reduced the HOMA-IR, which is a measure of insulin resistance. So the insulin sensitivity drastically improved when they went on this potato diet in the analysis of participants who completed the study. So basically what they're showing here is adding in potatoes actually improved insulin sensitivity in normal healthy people. So this flies in the face of the idea that these carb sources are just worsening your insulin resistance and just driving up insulin, and then your body's getting tired of insulin. Actually, what we're seeing is these carb sources are improving insulin sensitivity and reversing insulin resistance, and we have actual studies here. We have randomized feeding trial. We have meta-analysis of randomized control trials. And then we also have a systematic review and meta-analysis. And some of these, the oats one was in diabetic patients. These other two were in normal individuals. So this counters this argument that these carb sources are problematic. To be fair, I think candy and pizza and soda are likely going to be problematic, but carbs or glucose is not inherently problematic, especially if the sources are appropriate. And it's important to have this nuance so we don't have people just going and eating 2 eggs for breakfast and then being like, oh, I don't feel that good, or I'm under stress, or I'm not eating enough. We want to actually have a solid diet, and you can incorporate carbohydrates. Now, this last piece here is probably going to be the most interesting. So Jessie shares a meta-analysis on low-carb and very low-carb diets to support her point, but I'm not so sure she actually read the full meta-analysis because the way she promotes it is a little bit misleading. So let's hear what she has to say, and then let's actually use the same study that she read, and we'll see if it actually lines up exactly with what she's saying.
And if you're wondering about the science, there's a really interesting 2021 review that made it very clear that the best way to reverse type 2 diabetes is to flatten your glucose curves, is to avoid those glucose spikes. The study was called Efficacy and Safety of low and very low carbohydrate diets for type 2 diabetes remission. Systematic review and meta-analysis of published and unpublished randomized trial data. And in this study, they saw that diabetes remission was observed in over 57% of participants at 6 months. And we have so much evidence today that now even the American Diabetes Association started endorsing diets that lead to smaller glucose spikes.
Basically, what she's saying is that on the low carbohydrate diet, they say diabetes remission in over 56% of participants. That is not what this study said. So let's get into that. And again, I'm just going to read from the study and I'll explain what the quotes mean, but this is not what the study said at all. It said this to some extent, like kind of, but not the way she's promoting it inside this video. So the quote where they say this, they say at 6 months, compared with control diets, low carbohydrate diets achieved higher rates of diabetes remission, defined as a hemoglobin A1C less than 6.5%. So we have 57% versus 31%. Okay, so this was on the control diets, 31% of individuals actually went into remission, whereas in the low carbohydrate diets for the 6 month intervention, 57% went into remission. So it's not that it's better than the control by 56%. What they're showing here is it was better by 26%. So there's an actual, the number is a little bit inflated. Now the next thing, and this is where things start to get more interesting, is they say conversely, smaller non-significant effect sizes occurred when a remission definition of hemoglobin A1C less than 6.5% without medication was used. So in these low carbohydrate diets and also control diets, they were using medications, and when they took out the groups that were not using medications, the actual statistical significance was gone, like it was eliminated. So basically, if you go on a low carb diet and you use diabetes medications, then you can see 56% remission, but that is defined by hemoglobin A1C less than 6.5%. We'll talk about why that's a problem, versus the control diet. So again, you actually don't see statistical significance when the medications were removed. So it's not like the low carb diet is just doing this in general. Also, something to point out is that the low carb diet is not necessarily working by just flattening glucose curves. So she's pointing it out as like, oh, it's just flattening glucose curves. No, you're not having glucose at all. The glucose that you're getting is coming from your liver producing glucose via gluconeogenesis, this is a very different circumstance than just saying I'm flattening the glucose curves. This is saying you're not eating carbs at all, especially because this was low carb diets and very low carb diets. So some of these were keto diets. Now, the next thing they say here in this study, same study, subgroup assessments determined as meeting credibility criteria indicated that remission with low carbohydrate diets markedly decreased in studies that included patients using insulin. So if this individual was an insulin-dependent diabetic, then the low carbohydrate diets weren't necessarily decreasing or putting these people into remission, right? So that's another thing. It depends on what type of diabetic you were. And it only lasted for 6 months. So let's hear what happens at 12 months. They say at 12 months, data on remission were sparse, ranging from a small effect to a trivial increased risk of diabetes. Large clinically important improvements were seen in weight loss, triglycerides, and insulin sensitivity at 6 months, which were diminished at 12 months. So 6 months of this low carb or very low carb diet seem to have some benefits if you were also taking medication, diabetes medication, but you weren't on insulin. But then at 12 months, the effects were gone. So this is not saying that flattening glucose curves, this study is not supporting that flattening glucose curves is what's putting people into remission. Now, the last thing that these authors say here is they say limitations include continued debate around what constitutes remission of diabetes, as well as the efficacy, safety, and dietary satisfaction of long-term low-carbohydrate diets. Now, the very low-carbohydrate diets, satisfaction and maintenance on the diet was poor, which is why I say that. But something important here to mention, the cutoff in the studies for determining whether diabetes went into remission was hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of the 3-month average blood glucose concentration. Now, why is this problematic to use as a marker on a keto diet or a low-carb diet? Well, if you're not having carbs, having less than 50 grams of carbs, your blood glucose levels are always going to be low, period, because you don't have carbs coming in to actually raise the blood glucose levels. So yes, hemoglobin A1C is going to be low if you've been low carb for 3 months, because you're not increasing blood glucose when you're taking in carbs. So it's going to stay low. It's not increasing at all. And now this doesn't mean that you're in diabetes remission, because when you have somebody add carbohydrates in, their hemoglobin A1C will go back up. If there's still metabolic dysfunction, the blood glucose values will increase. So it's important to understand what metric you are using to determine whether somebody's in remission or not, and how you're going about lowering that metric. If you're going about lowering that metric because you're not raising blood glucose, because you're not eating carbs at all, that doesn't mean you don't have metabolic dysfunction anymore and you've thus solved the problem. It just means that you're not eating carbs. That's it. So it's important to understand what the metric that you're gauging by is, and then also fully read the studies that you're going to cite. And again, to be fair, I didn't even have to go through this full meta-analysis. I actually pulled up the abstract of this meta-analysis that she cited, and these points were all in the abstract. So we didn't have to even parse through the data sets, look at how they did the statistical analysis, or even go through all of the methods for what they were doing. We could just see it in the abstract. So the due diligence on her side here is pretty poor, because I don't even think she read the full abstract based on what she's saying, because you're showing at 12 months you're having a diminished effect. Like, I wouldn't promote that if you're just seeing at 6 months. And also, this is not saying anything about glucose spikes directly. This is saying about not eating carbs or glucose at all. And then you're seeing a lower hemoglobin A1C value because you're not eating carbs. It's not necessarily meaning that you're in remission. That was the cutoff value that they were just using to gauge remission. So these are important things to dial in, and these are important things to understand. And again, I want to be fair here. I think some of the ideas that she presents in terms of the actual implementation is good. I think the idea that she promotes to people that changing your diet and lifestyle can help to improve your metabolic function and help to minimize diabetes or the effects of diabetes or consequences, or from it getting worse or possibly reverse it. I think those are great ideas. I think moving this away from the idea that this is just genetics and that you're just doomed to it, so you just have to take medications and drugs and do all these procedures, and that's the only way to go, and basically eliminating people's ability to actually have agency and affect things, I think that's a great idea. I think all of these things that she's saying in those perspectives are awesome, are helpful. I think her general message in terms of teaching people how to eat better or focus on the diet is extremely useful, but I disagree with her on the specific mechanisms in terms of what's causing diabetes. And the reason I'm actually pointing this out is not just to bash her. The reason I'm pointing this out specifically is so that we can start to understand what the true mechanism is of this metabolic dysfunction, and then figure out strategies that can actually minimize this metabolic dysfunction. And also, this doesn't mean that some of her strategies don't help to minimize metabolic dysfunction, even if her understanding of the mechanism or her description of the mechanism isn't correct. It doesn't mean that the interventions may not work as well. Some of them may actually be helpful, and I do use some of them with some of my clients that have type 2 diabetes because it does make a benefit. For example, having carbohydrates with a protein, with a fat, and with fiber makes a huge difference for a lot of people in managing blood glucose levels and not going on the roller coaster and things like this. But again, I don't think that glucose and insulin are the direct problems. I think that metabolic dysfunction is, and we need to focus on this to correct the problem instead of focusing on just glucose and insulin.